But without further ado, I'd like to sort of start, and maybe with you, Mark, and ask all of you, what are do you see as some of the key drivers of sort of business-led social innovation? What are some of the incentives that are needed, and also some of the obstacles that we need to overcome? And Mark, I'll start with you.
Good, thank you. Am I on? Yep.
I think you are, yeah.
Good. So yeah, thank you, Jane. Great to be here. So good to see so many people here on a Monday morning. It might come as a surprise to many of you, but my Monday mornings in Barclays don't often start with a DJ, so this is a great way to start the week. So firstly, in terms of the what's driving the social innovation opportunity, I'll perhaps start more broadly than come into Barclays and share some thoughts on what's driving it here. I think firstly we heard this word scale, I think, already several times this morning, and for me that's really the opportunity. It's so clear that we need to have business models involved to have impact at scale. We have some really impactful partnerships with non-profits in Barclays, and I'm lucky enough to be a part of many of them and see many of them, but so often limited by how much money you have to give away through the grant-led model, and with governments, again, some really exciting, impactful initiatives led by government, which is often a redistribution of wealth through the tax system rather than generating its own wealth and driving sustainable impact. And if you think about the scale of the challenges facing the planet today, take climate change as just one example. Estimated, I think, that 5 trillion of investments required by 2030 just to keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees. And the total amount of money given to charities last year in the US was just 400 billion. Huge amount of money, but a drop in the ocean. The amount of government spending in the US was, I think, 3.8 trillion. Whereas just the largest 500 companies in the US last year had revenues of $11.8 trillion. But more importantly, the activities in those companies were driven by they're self-sustaining. They make their own money. They're scalable. That impact, if you can wrap a business model around it, can go to scale. So really exciting opportunity. Such a huge opportunity if you can get this right. But it's hard. Innovation in business is hard, right? I mean, everyone here that works in a business knows that you often have very standardized investment criteria. You have often short-term reporting, which makes the decision-making short-term. You have, as a good friend of many here, I'm sure, Gib Bullock likes to call it, the corporate immune system, which pounces into action to shut down anything that looks a little bit different as you start to try and drive some of these social innovations. But one of my favorite quotes from Elon Musk says that actually business doesn't really exist. Business is just a collection of people working towards shared goals. And when Barbara tells you that 70% of the people in this building are millennials, and their shared goals are often driven by aligning their day jobs with purpose and wanting to drive social impact, you create a very powerful movement inside business when those collective talent from your organization starts to organize around some of these shared goals of impact. So we recognize that in Barclays, in order to overcome some of these challenges and to drive social innovation, if we were to capture this opportunity, we needed to find a way to surface these passionate entrepreneurs, these folks inside our organization who are driven by the opportunity to drive social impact through their day job, and then unleash them on the business. So we set up, as Barbara mentioned, the Social Innovation Facility back in 2011 now, so 6-7 years ago. It was a dedicated resource for internal innovation within the business. We put aside £25 million and set up a governing council of our most senior leaders that Barbara chaired to make the investment decisions, help us set the strategic priorities, and then to support those innovators in the business, to enable people to take a risk, to fail fast, in Barbara's words. And since then, we've invested, I think, in over 50 propositions around the world. Just last week, launched our first impact investing fund in our UK wealth business, a business which has access to hundreds of billions of capital in assets under management from our clients. If we can just channel a small percentage of that into impact, then think of the opportunity there. So I will just end by saying I'm probably the most optimistic person in Barclays because I get to spend my day supporting these young millennials, these entrepreneurs who are really passionately driving change from within, and get to spend the rest of my day working with organisations like Unreasonable, who are supporting entrepreneurs to drive change. So yeah, I'll pause there.
Great. And I'd just like to follow up on two things. One, it would just be interesting if you could give us a couple of examples of the 50 propositions that you've invested in. And it's a great example, as you say, of entrepreneurs within the company being mobilized and supported to come up with great ideas, and then the company putting money behind it. So I'd love to hear a couple of examples of that. And then also, the question of the role of investors. You talk about your impact investing fund. The risk of putting you on the spot, would be great to hear how you think the investment community can be moving more, both individual high net worth investors, but more broadly.
So on the first one, in terms of examples, one of the great things about working in financial services is that almost every aspect of daily life there's a role for financial services to play. So we've had propositions within our social innovation facility. We've heard already about GSK, so everything from healthcare through to education. We developed a college savings account which combined behavioural finance and gamification to help first generation college students save towards college here in the US. We have developed propositions for serving military to help them manage their finances, that combines education and innovative products. We have supported small, fast-growing businesses across several markets in Africa to access the capital they need to grow to become part of our corporate client supply chains. So a huge array of different propositions. The Women in Leadership Index that Barbara mentioned was, you can look it up, WIL, on the markets and see how it's performing. It's a really innovative proposition that combines a product with an index to help you track and invest in companies that have diverse executive leadership. So a huge array of products. As I say, finance is relevant right across society. Often as that enabler of impact rather than being quite as obviously on the front line of impact, but channeling that capital into those activities. Right. On the investors' perspective, I think it's something that's I certainly see momentum. It's not going to change overnight. Our impact platform in the UK, the longest part of the innovation process, once we tackled the internal corporate immune system, was actually having the conversations with regulators. Financial services is probably the most highly regulated industry on the planet. So starting to move those conversations forward around fiduciary responsibilities and how you start to bring this third axis around impact alongside risk and returns, how you market the product, how you talk about it, how we educate our banking colleagues to sell it to their clients and to position impact for their clients. And move away from this concept that you must give up some return if you want to take impact into your portfolio. So we're on the journey. Things are moving there, but it's going to need, I think, a lot of partners coming together, and these types of events, the collaborators in the room here can all play their role. Great,
good, and I hope we can come back there, because it seems there's an enormous opportunity for the banks and institutional investors to work more creatively with some of the large companies. But Kate, on to you. You and your colleagues have played, I think, a really transformational role within Pearson in terms of getting the world's sort of largest education company to think much more creatively and in a more innovative way about improving access to education, supporting literacy. It'd be great to hear some of your experiences and both the opportunities but also some of the challenges you faced.
Yeah, and I was thinking about when you were asking the question about sort of challenge and opportunity, and I would say that for us, the need for a cultural shift has been really fundamental. So 3 years ago, I think our whole approach to social innovation was relatively nascent. We had an affordable learning fund where we were investing in edtech entrepreneurs in developing markets, but it's relatively small, and also I think really importantly, it was almost to the side of the business, it wasn't mainstream. And generally when we thought about our social impact activity, again, it was super arm's length. It was through a foundation. And so really the journey that we've been on and still continue to be on is how do you really build that social innovation capability? And huge appreciation to Mark, because I think when you're trying to instigate cultural shift, you need credibility and being able to, one, take the learnings from Barclays, and you've been enormously helpful from that perspective, but also as well to be able to show examples of other companies that are doing it successfully really helps when you're doing the internal sell. And the big step I think for us is that we now have, thanks to learnings from Barclays and others, we've got an incubator, and why is that proving to be successful? Well, I think because one, our mission, as an education company, it's how do we make people make progress to their lives through learning, and that is for everybody, whatever situation they are in, whatever economic place they find themselves in, and then it comes to, okay, so what's the commercial opportunity though with that? And we know that there are 4 billion low-income people, who our products and services aren't yet touching, and that's a massive commercial opportunity. It's probably around 5 trillion, and we're not fully realising that. So then the question is, how do you make that resonate within the business, so that you can bring it down into to a more bite-sized play? And also, and I think this has come out in all the speakers this morning, it's risky.
Yeah.
And how do you convince the business to take on initiatives to extend the reach of their existing products and services, or think about new innovations, when they don't know how long the return will take to realise? And that's, I think, where redirecting what historically would have been philanthropy, CSR spend to social innovation really works. And so I find, from my perspective, I partner much more with our head of global product than I ever did in the past. And it's all about saying, okay, how do we bring our R&D capability? How do we bring in our commercial leaders much more into the process? And that's what I think has been successful with the incubator, in that to the investment panel, it's myself, members of the team, it's our head of global product, and really importantly, it's our head of business development. And then everybody who's putting initiatives forward has to have serious commercial sponsorship to get through the various process stages. So I think we are nowhere near as far along as Mark and Barclays are, but I think we're beginning to see we're now at validation. We've gone through hundreds of applications, down to 17 who got the initial round of funding, down to now to 5. And the 3 big incentives are, yes, focus on low-income communities. Does it look like it's got the potential for return? Maybe over a longer period of time. And I think that's what having the social impact investment enables the organisation to feel more relaxed, that the returns aren't going to be in the usual time frame. And thirdly, is it something that the business leaders have got real skin in the game, and that they're going to take it on within the organisation? So, and just because perhaps it's a segue through to Daniel on this one, who's been an amazing partner for us. I think the other way that we've been looking at it, and again, one of the questions that keeps coming up today, is how do you scale?
Yeah.
And because you're on our literacy advisory board, that one of our big areas of focus is literacy. 750 million people in the world today without basic literacy skills. Huge amounts of great work done in that space, and we know that there really isn't a dent in the numbers.
Yeah.
And how do you make that difference? And one of the initiatives that we're, and Project Literacy is a big coalition of partners now, more than 200. Unreasonable has been a phenomenal partner on this. And one of the areas that we've looked at in scaling is using Daniel's expertise and bringing in a group of social entrepreneurs who aren't necessarily focused on education at all. I mean, one of our big social entrepreneur partners is Afropads, that's all about looking at sanitary protection for women. And why are they interested in working with us? Because 1 in 10 girls in Africa drop out of school because they don't have sanitary protection. And so working with those entrepreneurs to build into their business model literacy programs has made the reach increase through their customer base over a 12-month period from 4.5 million to 10 million.
Wow.
And what do they get in return? Well, they get access to investors, they get mentoring, they get support from within Pearson. But it's been a phenomenal partnership. And the thing I love about it, which is, and then it's about, which you, when people hear Daniel, if they don't already know, will understand why, is the energy and just the speed with which these guys work. And they're so nimble and so willing to flex and so brave, frankly, in what they do, that it's been one of our most energizing initiatives, and also really giving us hope that whilst the challenge is huge, when you start to really harness the power of social entrepreneurs, you make a real difference. So I think it's about looking at entrepreneurs, and last thing I'd say is that's really interesting for us, because I think, like so many companies at the moment, we're facing such disruption.
Yeah.
So that need to, recapture that entrepreneurial spirit, both through our partners but also with entrepreneurs internally, is really fundamental. And we grew by acquisition, and we have lots of great entrepreneurs in the company, but over the years they've slightly got atrophied in a big multinational. And I think what we're trying to do with social innovation is really unleashing that again.
Great, Neil. Thank you. And I think a great example of sort of having the both the culture, the mindsets, as well as the skill sets to do that and to build that sort of social innovation capacity in the company. And I hope we can come back a little bit later to sort of advice to other companies here. You both have got good examples of sort of setting up senior business leadership, sort of governing bodies or investment committees to drive this forward, and it'll be good to understand that a little bit more as we move forward. But Daniel, on to you. As Kate says, you have dealt with thousands of social entrepreneurs, connected, funded, catalyzed them. What are the big obstacles to scaling, and what do we need to do, those of us in this room, whether companies or governments and donors, to move this agenda forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something we're scratching our heads every day about in terms of scale for the entrepreneurs themselves. Scale for the entrepreneurs and scale for solving and having a real impact in solving the challenges that we're facing and reaching particularly the people most left behind. Yeah, I think that scale happens through partnership. So if you look at entrepreneurs and if you look at multinationals, they're both best in the world at very different things. I would say entrepreneurs are best in the world at being agile, wielding very disruptive technologies, being able to rapidly ideate, prototype, get something into market very quickly. What entrepreneurs are not good at and what they desperately struggle to try to figure out is how do they hit intercontinental, international scale, and how can they build in the operations and the HR practices and the distribution and the supply chains to be able to do that. If you look at multinationals, they're arguably best in the world at that, but what multinationals desperately struggle with is this rapid ideation, disrupting themselves before they get disrupted externally, and so on and so forth. And so if you can create the conditions in which entrepreneurs and multinationals can meaningfully collaborate, and actually they can bring to bear both of their strengths and therefore offset their weaknesses in a very genuine way, then I think you can actually have a chance at hitting true scale. And without that, it's going to take these entrepreneurs far too long to be able to solve these problems faster. And I think that the multinationals, to Mark's point, the corporate immune system, it's going to be really hard to do all of that just internally. And so I think finding ways to meaningfully, productively, profitably collaborate between these entrepreneurs and the MNCs, I think that's the key. And can you give us some sort of specific examples of how you've done that? Because it's sort of one thing of, GSK and Barclays sort of cooperating and they're equal partners and they can bring similar things to the table, where you've got potentially power imbalances, certainly different sizes. What are some examples where you're seeing this happening, and that could be models for others in the room? Yeah, two of the examples are here. I think it was just a coincidence. I don't know if it was or wasn't, but really privileged actually to be on stage with Kate and Mark. They're two of our biggest partners and true co-founders. And Kate, you mentioned that we have a lot of courage, but I actually think that the creative courage comes from you as partners to partner with somebody called Unreasonable. I think that takes a lot of courage. Maybe before I dive into that, just your original question was, why is this important? Why do we need to partner? And I was thinking about that when you asked it. I think there's a moral case and then there's a business case, and I'd love to give both really quickly. A really good friend of mine, he's an amazing entrepreneur. He's one of our mentors at Unreasonable. He tells a story, and you all will probably possibly resonate with this. I know I do. He said that he was watching the nightly news one evening and was listening to the headlines as they went by on the screen. And I don't know about you all, but when I do that, it's a little bit depressing. And it's kind of global issue after global issue after global issue. And he's watching this, and he sits back in his chair, and how he tells the stories, he looks at the screen, and he thinks to himself, he goes, I wish they would do something about this. Like, why aren't they doing anything? And he kind of sits for a second, and then he realizes to himself, in his words, he goes, holy shit, there is no such thing as they. There's only us, there's only we, there's only I, and I need to start now. And so I think part of this on the moral side is if you watch the news and you're discouraged, do something about it. And I think that's the first side. I think on the business side, CSR I think is now the new R&D. If I could change the acronym, it'd be CSO, it'd be Corporate Social Opportunity, because I think that there are there's immense value in partnerships where you can align trajectories around where the company is going to need to go. So to Kate's point, 4 billion people who you're not reaching right now, with the business model, $5 trillion market opportunity, how do you get access to that very large global market? And it's our belief that entrepreneurs are a beacon into where you should go, because they're ahead of the curve. So a couple examples, just specific examples of entrepreneurs we've worked with. Mark knows her really well. One of the entrepreneurs in the Unreasonable Impact Partnership, which is with Barclays, her name is Jennifer, and her company is called Lonzatech. Jennifer's in her 60s. She had actually retired, got pulled into this company because she realized just how this could really change the course of history. She looks at pollution, so CO and CO2 emissions at the source, at the smokestacks with factories. And right now she's working largely with steel mills, originally in China. Instead of having the CO and CO2.
Massive steel mills.
Yeah, absolutely. Very large.
So
Yeah, very large.
Individual entrepreneur working.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And instead of having the CO and CO2 emit into the atmosphere through the smokestacks, she takes it, she pipes it into a fermentation tank. So the way you make beer, right, is bacteria, sugar, and water. She has bioengineered bacteria, her and her team, and her company's called Lonzatech, so they can literally, once they pipe the CO and CO2 into a fermentation tank, the bacteria eats it and converts it into either polyethylene or ethanol. Polyethylene is plastic, ethanol is jet fuel. So she's literally making jet fuel and plastic out of pollution at the source. There is no waste that comes from this process other than the shells of the bacteria, which is an organic fertilizer. But to hit scale, she needs a partner. And so you'll all hear about this on the headlines in the next few months. But Boeing and Virgin Atlantic partnered with Jennifer and Lonzatech, and later this year, Virgin Atlantic will fly the first ever commercial airliner powered on jet fuel made of pollution. This is modern alchemy in a very real sense of the word. She's raised over $300 million now, largely through strategic investors. These corporations are looking at this and saying, wow, I can take my biggest waste and actually turn it into an asset and sell it. So that's one example. Another one, to help make it real, we worked with a company called Thread. Their entrepreneur's name's Ian. And when Haiti, when the earthquake hit, like many people, he wanted to do something about it. He didn't know what. He was talking to a friend in a bar in Pittsburgh, and said, wow, we need to do something. And his friend said, well, let's just fly there. So in essence, there's no such thing as they. Put himself in that position, went down to Haiti, and noticed that there were two things that were big problems. One was there's plastic trash everywhere. Second one was that there were no jobs. And if you're going to rebuild an economy in a sustainable way, you have to have them. And so he looked at that, and like most entrepreneurs, looked at it a massive challenge and saw a huge market opportunity. So his company, Thread, they're providing jobs for over 3,000 individuals in Haiti now. And how it works is they collect plastic trash off of the streets and they convert it into literally thread, into material for clothing. But the way that they hit scale was they partnered first with Timberland. They partnered with Timberland to create a new clothing line made out of plastic trash from the streets of Haiti that is helping people get out of poverty. When they launched this new clothing line, it was the #1 seller the first month it was online for Timberland. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you can find the right entrepreneurs as a multinational, you can have partnerships that are not just good for the planet, they're extremely good for your bottom line, but they're also going to future-proof your company. And if we're nervous about where our companies sit today, I think it's a lot scarier when you look 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the road. And these entrepreneurs really are the beacon of where things are moving. And so our job is create the conditions in which multinationals can productively collaborate in a genuine way without power dynamics with these entrepreneurs. Because you're both best in the world at different things. These entrepreneurs don't hit scale without you. But I would argue that you likely don't survive in the long term without them.
I just give Daniel. I think Daniel's telling himself a little ritual because I think one of the things that Unreasonable really captures as well, it does this amazing sort of speed partnership dating. And I've been in sessions where I've just come in as a mentor, and he literally has an entrepreneur. The entrepreneur puts up the problem. And I'll give you one example. It's an amazing Colombian entrepreneur who's discovered the first natural colouring for blue. Who knew there wasn't a natural blue dye before? And he's really keen that should return the revenue from that should go back to the rainforest and really work on the whole sort of climate change piece. And he has an hour session, you put the problem, and then everyone's allowed to ask clarification questions. Then it's over to everybody in the room to come up with the solutions. And literally, no joke, Jane, in the course of an hour, I was being worked out to try and sort out his brand proposition and proposal. There were other technical experts. And then, here's the key thing, he had high net worth individuals, and overnight, and just then, this Chinese entrepreneur, committed to fund it there and then. And this sort of happens repeatedly. And immediately, you're getting that scale. And I think it's that energy and pace, which is so exciting.
I was just going to say, I think the important point in that example, too, is that it's not just multinationals and entrepreneurs. We're bringing together all the actors. We're bringing together policymakers, ultra-high net worth, sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, foundations, everybody. And if you can bring them all together with a strong, what we call intention grenade, is let's scale these solutions because they work and they're profitable. But then amazing things happen when everybody's together in the same place. And I think that's a really important aspect of accelerating serendipity, but also productivity and scale.
Great. And it would be good as we sort of talk about getting these sort of ecosystems working a bit more, how you actually do that, and do you focus on a particular SDG or group of SDGs or geography, where you can get that sort of convening at the system level. But great. I think so far we've heard sort of a number of interesting examples. We've heard sort of two large companies working together, and there are many examples I know in the room of other large companies working with each other, and a core group of the companies acting as a vanguard, large companies working with individual entrepreneurs, both their internal entrepreneurs and external entrepreneurs. I'd like to come to you, Gareth, because obviously another very important source of both funding but also enabling and support are donors, the development finance institutions, aid agencies, and foundations. And great if you could tell us a bit about the Global Innovation Fund, because I think it's a pioneer in itself, bringing together a collection of public donors, but to catalyse social innovation and market-led solutions. So if you could tell us a bit about it and what you're seeing as some of the opportunities and obstacles.
Absolutely. So the Global Innovations Fund was set up initially by USAID and DFID to take government money and to invest it in a range of sort of very broad criteria. We can invest in any developing country, any sector in those countries, and into any business model. And we can use any financial instrument to do it. So we do some grant making, but we also do equity and debt investing, and we've just done our first development impact bond. What drives or underpins all of our work is a commitment to evidence. So, we work with academics, we work with for-profit companies, we work with NGOs, and when we invest in them, we want to see properly evaluated evidence of social impact. And I think we fill an interesting place in the market that responds in part to a challenge laid down at the Development Finance Forum in Dublin last year by Paul Collier, who said what we are lacking is a VC for fragile states. A vehicle that can make early stage investments, often with higher country risk and higher financial risk, in order to de-risk these businesses so that commercial investors can come in after us, so that corporations can essentially potentially buy out or invest in those businesses, or those businesses could scale through the public sector. So we've got a pretty broad remit, and it means we can work on some pretty interesting issues. I think what enables really impactful social innovation, including from the corporate side, is a combination of knowledge and bloody-mindedness. And the knowledge is, and by knowledge I mean both technical knowledge, but also a real and deep knowledge of the social issue we're confronting. And Barclays are a really good example of this. In some of the domestic work they've done in the UK, when I was working in government, I knew a number of Barclays staff were working on your life skills program, and they really understood the issues that young people in the UK were facing. They met young people very regularly. I know you had an advisory board that included young people. And so there was a real knowledge of the issue you wanted to tackle, and a real willingness to seek out innovation in that space, rather than purely seeking out innovations. And I think that's one thing we run into a lot. From time to time we're challenged by various players who say, well, go out and find the next M-Pesa. If we're looking for the next M-Pesa, we're not going to find it. If we are seeking innovation broadly, then we might find its equivalents. So, I think that knowledge of bloody-mindedness is key. And it plays very much to what you were saying before about the need to secure a buy-in at every level of the organisation. I think that, having that technical knowledge, having that issue knowledge, and also having that broader buy-in and the determination to fight one's corner on what someone's working on is really key to driving that innovation. And then, there's a place in the market for organisations like the Global Innovation Fund to take a bet on early stage innovations and to be really agnostic about how they may scale, and then to crowd in interesting partners. An example of that is we have funded an organisation in northern Nigeria called Babangona. Everyone who sees Babangona's business model and understands what they do love it. That includes commercial investors. DFID are huge fans of the business model. And they were doing a funding round recently where there was a huge amount of interest. The Series B round was oversubscribed. But the major issue in getting the money into Babangona was the risk profile of investing in northern Nigeria. At GIF, we have both some knowledge and a lot of bloody-mindedness. So we seem to team in. Because we're funded by governments, now we count DFID, USAID, Swedish CEDA, Australia's DFAT, and South Africa's Department for Science and Technologies amongst our funders. Because we're spending public money, the bar we set around diligence is extremely high. So we sent a team to northern Nigeria to undertake the diligence, and then all of our co-investors in that round were able to rely on our diligence and get it through. So that's all we can be catalytic in that kind of way. Because we take smart risks, we can invest in early stage, we can be patient, we can take concessionary terms in order to really drive collaborative funding. And I think that, I turn to it always in my work to bloody-mindedness and a little knowledge.
Great, good. Thank you, Gary. And can you sort of say something, and I don't know if bloody-mindedness is part of this, but what are the sort of obstacles you face? Because as you say, and the minister sort of said, governments often are relatively risk averse because they've got their taxpayers and their citizens to answer to. Your point about evidence is really important, and also your due diligence. And could you say something about some of the obstacles, but how you're using due diligence? You're particularly making sure, picking back on something I sort of said earlier, you get the balance right between respecting human rights and decent work, and the innovation agenda. How you're doing due diligence and addressing sort of some of the risk aversion within government, so that we can get many more governments, given that government funding for development is actually very small, relatively speaking, to be used catalytically for market-based solutions.
You say government funding is very small. I rang one of my colleagues today who informed me that ODA spending is 150 billion, DFIs is 70 billion, foreign direct investment is 646 billion, remittances is 350 billion, domestic resource mobilisation, if properly enabled, would be 3 trillion, and CSR philanthropy is in excess of 80 billion. So I think it's not a lack of money, it's that resources aren't being mobilised in the right kind of way. And now that's, obviously, there are obviously exceptions to that. But I think taking a smart approach to investment, understanding risk, and it's great that DFID and USAID set up GIF. We could take on some more money and spend it in the same kind of way, but the GIF model should be replicated. Using different focuses, we're sector and geography agnostic. You could set up similar models to de-risk at an early stage based on specific geographies or in specific sectors. So I think that's one part of it. I think we've got a very thorough approach to diligence, including particularly environmental, social and governance risk. We've got an active legal team and often buy-in and external counsel. But what we've also got is an immensely strong analytics team. Our Chief Analytics Officer, Ken Shomitz, spent most of his career at the World Bank, and he's backed up by a team of people so that every investment we are doing will only come to our internal investment committee if it is properly analysed, and the social impacts of this are potentially very, very great. We have a model called Impact that looks at depth, breadth, and probability of success. And if the multiplier of those equals a particular bar, then actually it will come to our internal investment committee, and we really do a deep dive into that social impact. We also look at the business model. We're social impact first. That doesn't mean that financial returns shouldn't come. Often the things we invest in are very profitable. We invested into a technology play called M-Clinica, which is working in several nations in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines and Indonesia. And it links pharmacies using mobile technology. And it's an extremely interesting play. I'm almost certain it will be acquired. And it will be, certainly move beyond revenue neutral pretty soon. So, profitability needn't exclude social impact. The two can come together. But certainly our approach at the forefront is around social impact and properly evaluated social impact. And I think, in us working with whether it's with commercial investors, corporates, or governments in terms of scale, I think we're really focused on ensuring the continuity of social impact alongside the evolution of the business model to profitability.
Great. Well, thank you. So I think, again, a great example of sort of this combining the passion, the innovation, the energy with the due diligence, the evidence, and the managing social impact across the entire spectrum of social impact. Sue, last and certainly not least, you sort of are working with over 800 companies of all sorts of sizes, and you're mobilising both individually and collectively. Where are you seeing the opportunities coming on social innovation and some of the obstacles? And then I wanted to come back to each of you on how we strengthen the ecosystem, and then warning to everyone in the room, coming out to you very shortly on questions, comments, and ideas from you. But Sue.
Thanks very much, Thain, and thank you everybody else. I feel completely overawed. Some of the examples that you've all spoken about have just been amazing, and it's fantastic to have heard all these examples. And yes, I'm from Business in the Community. We're a charity. We have about 800 members. We're based in the UK. I'm responsible for a network of 140 partners in 70 countries who are similar to organisations like Business in the Community, who are focused on corporate responsibility and sustainability, working with businesses to really drive that agenda in their markets. What we do is work with business. We work with business to really help them understand what these agendas are about, what their role is in these agendas, what they should be doing, how they should be doing it, and actually sharing best practice, sharing case studies. Everybody on the panel, the businesses on the panel, and as many of you in the room, have been involved in what we've called our Responsible Business Awards, which is something we've been running for a very long time. I've been responsible for the award on the MDGs, now the SDGs, which has been running for over 15 years. And through that process, we received the most incredible examples of what companies, FTSE 100, Fortune 500 companies and small companies are doing in this space and have been doing in this space for a long time. I must admit, the examples I've just heard have just blown me away, so I'm going to be really coming at you for next year's entries. But the important thing of this, about what's driving innovation, what's driving innovation, I think, is the sort of the seismic shift that everybody has been seeing and experiencing and living through over the last 10, 15, 20 years. How the story went 20 years ago was so different. It was very much a philanthropic conversation. It was very much a CSR conversation. Of course, CSR is now CR, and the language has changed, and that's one of the issues, getting the language right, where everybody's speaking a common language. The SDG framework gives us that common language, as the MDGs did, but the SDGs are even better because they engaged business in the first place. So this drive and this need for people to understand, speak the common language, and actually understand the business benefit of what they're doing, as well as the social benefit. As I say, we're a charity, but all of our awards have always focused on the business benefit as well as the social benefit. So you might have the most amazing example of a huge benefit into a community, but if you can't demonstrate the business benefit of that, then it ain't going to win. It's not going to be a finalist, because it needs to have business benefit in order to be sustainable. So these seismic shifts that everybody has been seeing and experiencing, which have been demonstrating incredible disruption. The disruption factor is something we're living with, all of us are living with 24/7, but actually our world is open 24/7. The transparency required from everybody is total. And there is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Everybody can see everything. So the community of citizen is really coming to the fore and enabled by the digital revolution. And we very much talk about in Business in the Community, the digital revolution, the future of digital is human. The fact that all of this digital stuff, brilliant. But at the end of the day, it's about people. and about them surviving and them thriving and then and running and having fulfilling lives. So the pace of change is unrelenting. The seismic shifts we're all experiencing are huge and are all drivers of innovation. And I think the other thing I wanted to say was there's a huge rising tide of expectation across all stakeholders, whether they're investors, whether they're you, me in the high street. Sorry, you don't call it high street in America, do you? Main Street. Main Street. There's you in the Main Street. Wherever you are, it's you and me when we've taken our business suits off and we're being human. So that rising tide of expectation we all have, wherever we come from, whatever we do. And that's driving innovation. Business imperative is driving innovation. The need for business continuity, the need for secure supply chains, the secure value chain, that's all driving innovation. And blink, you miss it, or you suffer from it. If you have to innovate to survive. Standing still isn't an option anymore. And I think what's really exciting is the amount of evidence that there is around this, whether it's from individual projects and programs that we see, or whether it's through fantastic pieces of research. The research, Better Business, Better World, I'm sure you're all very familiar with it, identifying a 12 trillion opportunity. That's phenomenal. I think that's what's really coming to people's attention, where Business in the Community and many other organisations like us used to have conversations with the CSR department or the head of philanthropy. The conversations we have are in the boardroom. Actually, for us, it has always been about having those conversations in the boardroom, and we have to keep those conversations in the boardroom. But with a 12 trillion opportunity, those conversations are in the boardroom. But one of the challenges is to help to drive this innovation and continue to drive the innovation is for that knowledge not to just be sitting in this group here. We are all obviously preaching to the converted. We're all singing the same hymn. We all sing together on Sundays, Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays. But it's just us. And what we have to do is break out from just us and influence everybody else. Everybody else at breakfast tomorrow morning, at dinner tonight, not just in these environments. And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, for all of us. It's hindering innovation. And it'll enable innovation if we just talk and talk about what we do and how we do it, but not bore our friends to tears. Excite our friends about what we do. Just Daniel, hearing what you're talking about, what you've been talking about, all of us have been talking about, is exciting, whoever you are. You don't have to be a specialist in corporate responsibility and sustainability. You just have to be a living, breathing human being and listen, because the enormous opportunity is out there. So this 12 trillion opportunity is driving innovation, but not enough, because people haven't really heard it. We've all read the book, but nobody else really has read the book. We need to get the book out there. And the other thing is this 2.5 trillion need that's obviously also been valued. So opportunity is being driven, innovation is being driven by business imperative, business need, business opportunity, and that's what will continue to drive it. The examples of the awards and entries and the finalists we've had over the years, the awards are sponsored in the last few years by Unilever. Obviously, you can't talk about this agenda without tapping your head to Paul Polman. He's obviously been an absolute driver, innovator, believer, advocate. He's amazing. So enough said, Paul Polman, all hail. But there are other businesses also who are doing really exciting things. But the award entries that have come through in these last couple of years, I just wanted to bring some names of organisations you haven't heard of, that aren't the usual suspects. They aren't the ones that we're always talking about. There's a business in India called AYZH, A-Y-Z-H, who's been creating clean birth kits to help help mothers going through the birthing process, and they have touched. They've positively impacted over 1.5 million people, and they've been connected with 57% better improvement in birth numbers. That's an organisation nobody's even heard of, but they're doing incredible work. Our job is, all of our jobs are, to hear those stories and to share those stories as widely as we can, because they are incredible, innovative business models that are driving business benefit and community benefit. There's another example, Agro America, which is a tiny company in Guatemala. Living wage in Guatemala hasn't even been talked about. It is now. Living wage has been talked about in our markets, wherever markets we're coming from. I'm assuming nobody's here from Guatemala, but it's definitely not something that's been talked about in Guatemala and other markets around the world. Yet, Agro-America have picked up this agenda of living wage, understanding that the future of their business depends on the health of their employees and the health of their communities. And if people can't live on the money that they're being paid, that's going to impact their business. And phenomenal pieces of work have been done around this, great studies have been done around this, and they've demonstrated the benefit to their business by investing in their people. So it's a bit of a step beyond that. Our people are our business. We believe in our people are everything. It's going way beyond that and really picking that up. The Barclays and GSK example, phenomenal. Phenomenal because you've been able to talk about the failures, and you've been able to talk about the learnings, and you've shared those learnings. And I think that's one of the best examples of entries we've had in the last couple of years where you've actually come forward and said, you know what, it's brilliant, it's an innovation that we were developing together. We are powerful organizations with powerful egos. It's not easy to get organizations with such egos to work so closely and cleverly together, and obviously working with care, making such a big difference. But these stories, they need to come out, they need to be shared, and they will help drive innovation.
Great. No, well, thanks very much, Sue. And I think your point on living wage, I don't want to put her on the spot. I can see my colleague Caroline Rees here in the room, and this growing recognition that living wage, decent work, respecting human rights is one of the biggest drivers of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and empowering people around the world. So thanks for that example. I'm going to now sort of start opening up to Q&A, so if you can sort of start thinking, I want to sort of take 2 or 3 at a time, but just before we do that, I want to pick up Sue's sort of comment about moving beyond the usual suspects and this thing of how we create more of an ecosystem. And I'd love to hear sort of from each of you, what are 1 or 2 of the things that are going to be most important in terms of moving beyond the usual suspects and the companies that have been the pioneers, and many for the last 20 years. But is it investors? Is it value chains? How do we move beyond the suspects? Mark.
I think it starts with in our organisations, and that's the great news. We all can influence our own organisations far more than perhaps externally, and everything starts with one idea in the head of one person, and then if you can give that person support to help to foster that idea, to provide the protection and support in the early stages so they can navigate the business, then I think that's what we can all do. We think about 3 things in Barclays when we start to think about how to provide support to our entrepreneurs, and you mentioned 2 of them already. So mindset, skill set, and tool set. From a mindset perspective, this is hard. You're trying to do this inside big organizations. Resilience is key. Providing them support or network to draw on support from elsewhere and mentors is so vital. Skill set. We are not necessarily salespeople in banks. Certainly a lot of my colleagues need all the support they can get to bring others on board and to sell their idea and to ignite that passion in their colleagues. So the kind of skill set around how to sell your idea, how to build out the business model. And then finally, from the tool set perspective, think about what we can do to make it as easy as possible to get their idea into a test and learn phase. In business we are kind of have this mindset of perfection is everything has to be perfect before you can try anything and launch it. If you can provide a tool set which gives them the ability to just test something on a very quick small scale, then you can be so much more powerful in terms of getting over those initial hurdles to bring something to market. So providing that internal environment to support innovation, I think is going to be key.
Great. So a great example of moving beyond the usual suspects internally, the usual suspects being the corporate responsibility or sustainability teams, so moving both to individuals throughout the company, but also senior executives and managers. Other ideas of moving beyond the usual suspects, Daniel?
Yeah, I think it's all about alignment. So no matter what your company does, I can guarantee that I think everybody's here for that reason. There's an SDG that you would rally behind, and if you're Pearson, it might be future of learning. Barclays might be future of jobs and economic growth. Meeting with Facebook tomorrow about connecting the unconnected. That really matters to their business model. Coke with water, whatever it might be, there's an issue. And if you put a flag in the ground and say, hey, we want to solve this issue, we want to eradicate it, and in doing so bend history in the right direction, there are very few people who don't want to collaborate with you. We have we work with everybody from liberals to libertarians. We go public, private. We'll work with people who are literally just interested in making the next $1 billion and others who just want to impact the next 1 billion people. If you genuinely care about solving or reaching one of these SDGs, I think the world shows up, and it's about making it genuine. And so my push, as Kate was saying, was make it core to your business. Don't make it tangential. And if it's core to your business, then the business also will rally behind it. But I think it's just about genuinely saying, hey, we want to solve this problem. It matters to us. The trajectory of our company depends on it, as does the world. And so join us on this journey. And then everybody shows up.
Yep, the compelling case, Kate.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo what both Stu and Daniel have said. I mean, the scale of the challenges that we're looking at are huge and need big coalitions to be able to make a significant impact. And I think what Sue said is absolutely right about putting egos aside. And I know that when I look at things like the work we're doing on literacy, if we'd position that as a Pearson-led initiative, we wouldn't have a coalition today of 200 plus partners. And I think also, to Daniel's point, it's about really making sure that you're aligning it to people's strategies. So showing how literacy isn't just about education companies looking at literacy. Literacy impacts nearly every SDG that you look at, and therefore making that connection for people. I mean, suddenly you've got a whole village who's out there tackling it, rather than just very specific, education players.
Yeah, no, great. So I think two very important points there. One, it is, I think, one of the elephants in the room, and the challenges on corporate branding around flagship projects. And sometimes there's a real value for that and a need for that. And then when you're going beyond that individual branding to a genuine coalition, where there's a business benefit, but the corporate brand is in front and center. And then I think secondly, a very, very important point that we all need to bear in mind, and is challenging, in that we have the 17 SDGs, but the real there's that danger of just cherry picking one and not looking at the linkages between them and understanding what all the SDGs mean for every company. And then yes, there might be some that there's more opportunity to make an impact on than others, but understanding that the linkages and the holistic links between them is important. So thank you. Gareth, I mean, what are your thoughts on getting either more government donors involved or more companies that aren't the usual ones at the table?
Sure. So I mean, one thing, I hate cross-sector working. I think if you start from a position of these distinct islands, you are on the road to failure. So I think part of it is about creating a movement of we're all social businesses, or you're not, in which case your business can deal with that in its own ways, and your customers certainly will. So I think that's really key, and I think a relentless focus on what you want to achieve and proper evaluation of it. It's a pretty extraordinary thing that the one Millennium Development Goal that was achieved early was halving global poverty, which probably should have been one of the harder ones, but it's the one where we got there. So I think a relentless focus on the impact you're trying to have.
But with that one, 88% of it was China, right? And if we zoom in on where poverty is most extreme, sub-Saharan Africa, it's actually increased, right? So just to push back on that goal.
Thank you for boosting that bubble. I mean, the rise of China and to some extent India, yes, were primary drivers of achieving that goal, but we still achieved it. And the situation, and it's about replicating, the successes of that. I was in Korea last week, and if any of you go to Seoul, go to KOICA, the aid agency. There's this incredible museum. It's small, and it tells the story of the Korean journey from a recipient nation to a donor nation. Oh, yes. And it's incredible. Brilliant. And that we could replicate that story. We would live in an entirely different world. And I think relentlessly focusing on the impact we want to have is key, and frankly, the people that we want to impact.
No, absolutely, and I think it is. I mean, South Korea is one of the great examples of what's possible, where you've got different sectors, maybe not cross-sector per se, but working in a common vision. Sue, moving beyond the usual suspects, and then I'll be opening up. So I hope we're going to have some questions, comments, disagreements. Yep.
So moving beyond the usual suspects, I think it's about those that are doing it, bringing others in through their supply chain, through their value chain, and talking the talk, sharing the information. I am lucky enough to see incredible amounts of information that are owned by particular companies, but isn't necessarily released. And I get very frustrated about that. If you know at Pearson that this is why you do what you do and what it links to, then it would be, I know you will, but sharing it, what the links are, and sharing those links and sharing the evidence is so important. And some companies do well and other companies sit on it. And I think that's just a total waste of resource, a total waste of effort, and a total waste of opportunity. So I think sharing the evidence, sharing the insights, sharing the case studies is important. I think you just said there, Gareth, about customers certainly will out you if you don't out yourself, and will realise that your business is not sustainable. And I think the facts and figures that Unilever shared recently, that 31% of consumers are buying with sustainability in mind. This is something that's I'm very passionate about, having spent the last 20 more years talking about the fact that consumers will. Well, the consumers are now, and the other 21% want to. So the evidence is there now at a time when, for so long, everybody's been saying, yeah, will it come? Will they? Do they really mean that? Well, the evidence is now there. It's demonstrating itself. And I think the other thing is about big, hairy, audacious goals. You've got to set them. And if you don't set them, you won't achieve them. There was a fantastic conversation I had just before we started with someone, I won't say who, but she was saying, and it's a very big company. When we sort of talked about how did you set your targets, and she said, well, it was a combination of absolute passion and drive and a few educated facts. And now this company is achieving this big, hairy, audacious goal that it set for itself. And if you don't set the goals out there, you ain't going to achieve them.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to have the goals and that evidence-based commitment to evidence,
absolutely,
as well as the passion. Right. Opening up, I know we've already got one here, and if you could take a few others, another one there, and gosh, I'm going to have to be careful. So I'll take those three that I can actually see, and then, so these two gentlemen here, and then if you could just quickly introduce yourself as well. I'm sorry, there's a big few, yeah.
Congratulations. Congratulations, it's been a fabulous panel. My name is Martin Burt, and I'm with a Poverty Stoplight. The one elephant in the room is poverty. Mm-hmm. We have not talked about poverty. We're talking about efforts, but the key that I would like to suggest is that we zero in on the poverty part of the fight. How do we measure it? How do companies measure poverty? Who measures poverty? Do we allow company workers, mine workers, people in the villages measure their poverty? And we know that economic growth may not have an effect over the more marginalized population. Having said this, we know enough about poverty and multidimensional poverty and bottom-up approaches to attack this problem in a coherent way, because or else we run the risk of government efforts taking over and owning the fight against poverty, because business are seen more extractive than having any evidence that poverty, multidimensional poverty, has actually reduced. So I would like your feedback on that.
Absolutely. So, and I won't put her on the spot, and I know she's going to be on the next panel, but Kate from Mars, and Mars's new sort of income lab and the work that they're doing on that, I think, is really trying to get a rigorous evidence-based approach to that. But also the point, and hopefully we can pick it up, and that this is where respecting human rights, I think, is so fundamentally important, and it goes way beyond do no harm. Yes, one wants to prevent abuses, but by actually respecting human rights and consciously and proactively and explicitly focusing on decent work and decent jobs is one of the key ways business can play a role. But we'll pick that question up. So do you want to, while we've got the mic there, and then I'll come to this gentleman here, and then we take 4 and then do 2 rounds of questions and comments.
Okay, so my name is Tony Cole. I run a company called the Sahara Group. I'm from Nigeria. I also chair the private sector advisory group running the SDGs both in Nigeria and at the UN here with the SDG Fund. Talking first regarding business fights poverty and the collaboration we're talking about, the one thing that I have seen that has troubled me here is that I don't see a lot of collaboration between the businesses in this room and the businesses on the ground. And I think that's a major problem. If we really want to drive poverty out, I'm from Nigeria, and I know one of the things that I've seen happen is that role models, local role models, help drive poverty out, because people see it, they can relate to it, they know you, they know what you've done, and that way they can come out of poverty because they can do what they see you doing. If we don't have that collaboration in this room, I mean, I look around and I know everyone here is doing great things, but I don't see many Nigerians here. I don't see people who are doing things on the ground here, and their voices cannot be heard here. So I need to know if that is part of what we're talking about and how that has been driven.
Great, and that sort of local, both capability building and local action. Thank you. There's a lady over here. Yep, do you want to? Yep, and then I'll come to you, sir, and then we'll come back to the panel.
So I share the excitement that you expressed about just to hear these examples, to see how real this is. And I work with Acumen, and so we have a chance to also try to foster these partnerships and partner with a lot of the folks who are speaking. The thing that surprised me is, as we talk about the role of business and how important it is to engage them, we have corporate leaders who I think are seeing the potential and see the value even of working with risky, innovative social enterprises. Where things really struggle for us as we are helping our entrepreneurs develop those relationships is when they get into the middle management stage of working with a company. And you start to understand we're talking about a massive shift beyond the visionary, new vision of what's possible, but really changing how businesses work from top to bottom. And that one CEO can't necessarily make that happen. So I'm curious to hear, whether from the panel or others, just how are we really creating a cultural shift in how businesses work so that people are starting to see and be recognized for taking risk and creating positive change, not only at the CEO level or at the CSR level, but really all the way through the company.
Yeah, the middle management level, which is so crucial, off the block. So, and then we're back to the panel.
My name is Michael Smoland. I'm the founder of .sub. It's a technology company, a language-enabled technology company. First of all, I want to congratulate you. The 10 of the 11 speakers thus far have not spoken with American English. They've spoken with British or other English, and that's what we do.
Samuel, you say
and someone mentioned the word elephant in the room, but the real elephant in the room is certainly north of 95% of the people that all of you were talking about impacting do not speak English as their native language. And there's very little being done to communicate with people in their native language. And Mr. Nelson Mandela says, when you speak to a man in a language he understands, you speak to his head, and when you speak to him in his native language, you speak to his heart. And it is very easy today. No new technology has to be developed. Nothing has to be done. Everything exists to be able to tell all of your stories. And right now, we believe storytelling will help create the world. All of the storytelling that is being told about all 17 SDGs needs to be made available in the native languages of the people in the world who are going to be benefiting. Absolutely. And there's nothing that has to be developed. It's all there. It's a matter of being put it together in a way, and we're doing that. So language is a really critical variable in this.
Absolutely, and I think two very common sort of themes: local leadership, local language, local capability and partnership. So feedback, responses to those questions. How can business get better at both understanding and defining the poverty agenda, and not just leave it to government? The sort of local partners piece, and the middle managers and core business people in the company. How do we change culture?
On the last two questions, I think they're completely agree with what you're saying. But I think there's a relation here. Like Yasmin, to your point, how do you start to change a culture in an organisation? I think storytelling has a huge role to play in that, and starting to share some of those success stories, those case studies. Celebrating the successes and the failures from where this has been tried in business, and starting to demonstrate momentum. And then in business, once you, one of the things that I find interesting, certainly from the work we're doing here, is that when you have a success, everyone up until that point is perhaps putting up barriers and standing in your way. As soon as you have one success, everyone's like, why aren't we doing more of this? Why is this not something that we've been doing for the last 5 years? So sharing those success stories, starting to provide those case studies, which events like these can play a huge role in doing.
I think sharing success, but I think that middle manager permafrost point is really hard in terms of in terms of how you crack it. And I think one of the things that we're looking at with the incubator is because it's encouraging people down the organisation, and it's saying, okay, we're going to, if you like, protect you because you've all got seriously sort of like you've got your numbers to deliver on. But we'll provide the funding and we'll provide the support and the mentorship from sort of within the organisation, so you're buffered so that time is blocked for you to spend investing on it. And you don't need to worry about that. Because I think that's one of the concerns. It's not that you haven't got middle managers who are super keen to get involved in all of this. It's just that they've got the bottom line to deliver, and it's really tough for them. Mm-hmm. And then I pick up on, because I think your point as well about the working with the local companies is so important. I was in Jordan last week, and we've just doing a really good partnership with Save the Children. But the work that we're doing in terms of developing like a learning app which is all focused on maths and resilience, that wouldn't have worked if we hadn't worked with local companies in Jordan in terms of the content development, in terms of how you think about the whole sort of marketing piece, from a credibility perspective, as well as actually making it a really relevant app. And it also, back to what I was saying earlier about the work with Daniel's group, with those sort of rapid growth social entrepreneurs. One of the biggest challenges we have with the literacy challenge is how do you actually get those literacy programs to the people on the ground? And the best way to do that is with those local companies who've got local customer bases. And that's where we're seeing real reach into communities who otherwise we weren't touching and we weren't getting out to reach with the literacy programs.
And can you sort of say how you're identifying those local businesses and local entrepreneurs? Are they self-identifying, coming to you? Because
go to the guru.
Okay.
So the first two questions, I really appreciate both those questions. Everything we do at Unreasonable is about finding the innovator on the front lines who is locally already creating that change and wants to take it typically to global scale. So great example, just to make it real, in Nigeria we worked with a company called Paga. This also ties into poverty alleviation. They're looking at banking the unbanked and underbanked. It's a mobile banking platform, kind of like M-Pesa, but it goes across platforms, not tied to any telco company. When we started working with them, they already had scale. They're already impacting about 1 million people. Today, they're the largest mobile money platform in Nigeria. Created about 7,000 jobs. 90% of those jobs are for women, and they're reaching about 8 million users actively banking the unbanked. There's no way that we're going to dream up Paga as a solution in a boardroom here in New York City. That's going to come from the Nigerian entrepreneur on the ground who understands that market and launches his business there. Our role then is to come in and say, how do we give you an unfair advantage? How do we take you from 1 million, not to 8 million, but to 800 million people? Because that's what the situation is right now on the continent itself. And so how do we find these innovators? You actually mentioned EYES.
Yes.
We worked with EYES. They're actually an entrepreneur in residence when they were in an earlier stage a couple of years ago. But we don't do a call for applications for our programs at Unreasonable. We have found that we don't believe the most effective solutions of our time that the entrepreneurs behind those are going to apply. Oftentimes they don't think they need help, but also oftentimes they're so actually humble that they don't think they would get in. They don't think they would deserve it. And so just like you don't apply for a Nobel Prize, nobody applies for that. You get handpicked and privately chosen. We scour our networks. We have about 300 partners, and we reach out to all of them. We say, hey, who's on the edge of the future of literacy right now in India as a market? If you could bet on one company locally that is changing the face of education or learning, who would it be? And we'll listen to our local partners. We'll do a lot of primary research as well. We actually talk to our entrepreneurs as alumni and say, who's the top one in this market, because they typically know. And then we reach out, we privately invite, and we kind of handpick these companies. But we do that through a process of multiple conversations. And we have selection panels with our partners. The interesting thing that we're looking for, though, is we're talking about collaboration here and partnership. The word choice we use is pathological collaboration. How do you create an environment from pathological collaboration? Well, losing one's ego is really important. And so when we find these entrepreneurs, they may have a very compelling solution. You might be bringing clean drinking water to 2 million people. If we want to take that to 200 million people, though, that entrepreneur is going to have to be collaborative and therefore humble. So we actually select for humility in the selection process itself. It's another conversation.
Fantastic, Dan. And I'm sort of so conscious of listening to you, seeing Yasmin there from Acumen, I know there's someone from Ashoka here, just the incredible ecosystem out there now of amazing social/development entrepreneurs, who really are mutually reinforcing and finding more and more ways to link them to large corporations and to donors and to investors is a big opportunity area. Gareth, any comments, particularly maybe on picking up on the poverty question and local?
The poverty point's an question. It's an important one. We social businesses, and I include NGOs and others in that, we still haven't cracked the bottom of the pyramid. There's much more we can do. One of the key things is, as you were saying, we've got to be entrepreneur-led. And you talked about not designing things from a boardroom in New York. We do that far too much. I mean, last year in the conference I mentioned before in Dublin, one of the big asks was we need an Uber for farm machinery. And so all these people from the World Bank and others said about, well, how would we do it? And everyone got out their phones and was trying to work out, well, how would we replicate Uber for tractors? It was already being done in India and in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, we've invested in EM3 in India, and it's far smarter than any of us could have designed replicating Uber. And so, we've got to go and find those entrepreneurs, particularly and relentlessly focusing on the ones who are working with, in that case, with smallholder farmers at the bottom of the pyramid. That's how we will confront the huge scale of poverty, but also being entrepreneur-led once we find them. I think that's absolutely key.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, which is if you want to solve a specific social challenge, if you want to do it in a profitable way, I can almost guarantee you that somebody's on the front lines already doing it, and they're probably doing it at the scale of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Your job is to find them and then wrap them with the resources and create a real relationship with them, but they are there, to your point. We don't have to come up with new solutions. We need to scale what works.
Yeah.
And influence where we can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Developing country governments, when we're focused on developing countries, are a key partner. And we have to engage on all levels. And corporations operating in those countries often have very, sometimes challenging, but important relationships with governments. So there's a role for everyone within that broader social business ecosystem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also some of the big international NGOs. I've seen Sam Worthington here from the Interaction Organisation, how the Save the Children's and the CARES and the World Visions, which are operating on the ground, can also be the ears and eyes on identifying those local entrepreneurs. Sue, I want you to just pick up the permafrost, the clay level, whatever you want to call it, on middle management, and then I'm going to very quickly go to a few more questions, and then we'll wrap up.
So on permafrost, we're really good at permafrost in the community. Obviously, one of the models that we have used for many years now is something called seeing is believing. I don't know whether anybody has heard of that, but it's a model where we started by taking business leaders into communities in and around the UK, and we've done it internationally as well. Looking at key issues, understanding what the issue is, and getting businesses to understand what these issues are and what can business do to help. That's been something that's been so successful and so valuable in engaging business leaders that actually middle managers have wanted to be part of it as well. And I think that model has been translated and adopted by many other organisations and should be. And I think obviously that was yesterday's world, and we created that model, but actually FaceTime with real people and seeing it matters. So we spent a lot of time talking about that and sharing that. And I think another important point about the permafrost and melting the permafrost is one, encouraging the leaders to lead and to demonstrate, but also to draw up those others who are wanting to get involved. Give them permission to get involved, which is back to your point, Kate, and your point also, Mark. You give people permission to get involved and give them a system and a process by which they can offer these ideas and share these ideas, where sharing them and taking the risks is applauded.
Absolutely, and the mindset, skill sets, tool
exactly.
Tool sets.
Couldn't have said it better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks. Okay, we've got time for a few more. So I can see the gentleman there, Caroline, and then is there anyone on that side of the room? Okay, one there, and then Andreas. Sorry, and then the rest can pick up at the.
Thanks, Jane. Good morning. My name is Rob Cameron from Sustainability, and firstly, thanks to Business Fights Poverty. I was at the last year's event in Citibank hosted last year. This year, Barclays I imagine HSBC and Goldman's are queuing up to hold the next one. Fantastic conversation. I've got loads of questions and comments. I'm going to narrow it down to just one. One of the things that really worries me now is that we're in danger of getting wrapped up in our own conversation, and the point about mindsets has been raised. I want to just reflect very briefly on mindsets. In the work that we do, sitting as we do between the NGO community, the civil society organisations, but very much working with business, is the extent to which the battles of the past are dictating present day action. That whatever a business did wrong 40 years ago is now still to be held against them. If we're going to achieve the 2030 goals, we're going to have to really think very carefully about mindset. And I'd just like to hear a few reflections on what you're seeing as a panel around the extent to which we're held back, indeed, by the fact that we're not thinking about the future and making that the cause of our present day action. We're thinking about what was done 20, 30, 40 years ago, and holding that still against the action, against business. So I'm really bothered about that. We need a new mindset for the future.
Which is more forward-looking, not influenced too much by the past. Caroline. Whoops.
Thank you. Caroline Rees from Shift, a non-profit working on business and human rights. Jane, thank you for calling out this aspect of respect for human rights and how that needs to be embedded in this thinking about what is innovation and collaboration, what does good look like. And indeed, I was taking notes of the wonderful Guatemala example, you know, how tackling not just problems that are out there, but problems that are actually connected to your own business, this in-work poverty, child labour, forced labour, displaced communities, can be a source of innovation and collaboration to drive for change. I think the other aspect is indeed starting with the problems out there and hugely inspiring examples that's come from the platform around that. But the other way we think about the respect for human rights, of course, is how do we make sure that as we get excited about these new innovations, about these new products, these new services that can get to the bottom of the pyramid, that can service those in poverty, we're still also thinking about how they're getting made. Right? And I want to think about the social impact investing side of this as well, where I think a lot of that excitement is from the investment side, as this is a growth industry, getting people potentially carried away and not pausing to say, are we, even as we deliver for one group of people in poverty and in situations of abuse, ignoring or paying inadequate attention to those that are making those very same products? How do we bring it together?
Thank you, Caroline. One over here and one here. Gabrielle, do you want to try and shout? Sorry, mics.
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. Hi, I'm Gabriella Herzog with the U.S. Council for International Business. There's been a lot of references to elephants in the room, and so I wondered if I might contribute to the herd theme with just a very quick question about the role of government. So we focused a lot on all the very positive contributions that business is making. And I wonder if, with the SDGs in the first instance, focused on government and government delivering with business support, where in the thinking of the panel should we be talking about government and their role? We haven't heard as much about it today.
Great. And one final question here. And I'm very sorry to the folks we couldn't get to, but
Andreas Blüthner, heading at BASF Food Fortification and Partnerships, and I think it was a great panel. I've heard a lot of things that is confirmed by my 15 years working in that space. I just want to drive your attention a bit more on public policies and standard setting, because an innovation has a life cycle and there's a valley of death. So I mean, at the beginning there's a lot of enthusiasm, resources, maybe co-funding, then it becomes a best practice, then maybe one or two companies follow, it becomes a good practice. But how to make it a standard practice and then sustain that by an ecosystem including policies and regulation? I think that's a job traditional business also does by CEOs and associations, that they advocate to avoid lobby for more sustainable, better regulation. And I feel like looking over the 15 years, I think that would be the more mature approach, where also including financial systems to kind of create a pull factor that leads these innovation becoming a standard practice. And I think that's we need to tackle global problems.
Great. So I think very, very linked those two questions, the role of government standard setting and policy, which is definitely one way to get beyond the usual suspects. So sort of four different but somewhat related questions. Sue, do you want to take a stab at?
Okay, role of government and regulation. From the role of government, obviously creating an enabling environment is vital. Government providing that ecosystem and enabling that ecosystem and that regulatory system is really essential. I think actually having collaborative groups in the room which include government, where everybody can, again, lay aside their egos and just understand and focus on the issue that we're addressing. Because so often when you have mixed groups, you find that everybody starts playing their position. If the government's in the room and others are looking for funding, then actually the conversation is all about the funding and not about the issue. So somehow we have to find a much more effective way of keeping people focused on the issue. And the question on standards, I was in a meeting just last week with ISO and BSI on standards and standards around the SDGs and what would be an appropriate role for the standards world to develop. Very, very interesting. Before having the meeting, I had spoken to a number of companies to have their perspective on the idea of standards around the SDGs, and I got a resounding, oh, for goodness sake, no. There is enough standards out there already that are already addressing the issues that link to the SDGs. Can't somebody just find a way to show us how to link it all together, rather than give us more standards? So I just shared, that's what came back to me from the companies that I asked. And the conversation we then had with the colleagues in BSI was, okay, that's useful information to have as background, so what are we going to do?
That's the corporate immune system.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But certainly sort of building on what's there, but being more ambitious. I agree. Daniel?
Yeah. Part of the question is reminding me of a quote. Einstein was a professor. Somebody asked him, how does he teach his students? He said, I don't teach my students, I create the conditions in which they learn. I think we don't teach anybody how to partner or how to scale their impact. Our goal and job at Unreasonable is to create the conditions in which you get the right people in the room so they collaborate towards that end. And a big part of that is painting the future very clearly. I think the SDGs actually does a beautiful job of saying this is the future that we want, now let's all work towards it. Yeah, and obviously government is a very important part of that equation. We actually had the U.S. State Department about a year ago reach out to us and say, hey, what you do with multinationals, can you do it with the U.S. government? They said their top agenda was actually reaching the SDGs. So we launched an initiative. I was kind of uncomfortable with the branding of it, but it's with the UN and the State Department and a number of multinationals called Unreasonable Goals. The whole design intention of that partnership is create the conditions for public-private partnership to scale entrepreneurs on the front lines who actually have the solutions that can help us achieve the future we want to see. So I don't know if that's a response to the question. I was connecting a lot of different dots there. Yes, government's critical. Yes, actually standardizing what works is really important. It's hard to get there, to your point, but it happens, and it needs to happen faster. And I think we absolutely need to get clarity around that future, but the SDGs are a pretty beautiful framework of the future we'd want.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, do you want to pick up? And also, maybe if you can pick up, given all your government experience, both the role of government, but also this stronger clarity of alignment between the SDGs and respecting human rights.
Sure. So my government experience in both New Zealand and the UK is surprisingly similar. Civil servants are basically translators. You're translating. I worked in the Cabinet Office Partnerships team for a while, where we managed the relationships with a portfolio of the UK's biggest businesses. And forever we were translating what business was telling us into the language that ministers wanted to hear. And then you'd have to translate back in the other direction. And sometimes you'd throw an NGO and there was another translation piece that had to happen. I think we all need to embrace the social business thing. Get over the cross-sector stuff and all start speaking the same language on this SDGs 2030 agenda. And on that point, I think there is something around not waiting. There's a relentless impatience we should feel about how many SDGs we achieve well in advance of 2030. Yep. And I think that restlessness is going to be vital. So I think we have to speak a common language around the vision we all have for those SDGs and achieving them. And yes, they are different. And organisations like ours that are funders to corporations, we don't need to turn a profit. You guys do. but actually we need to really hone in on a commonality of language, and that's going to be immensely helpful. Yes, there's technical discussions that have to happen with government around regulation, but that's only a small part of it from my experience. And I think this idea of vision is really, really key. I think we do pretty well at articulating the vision of what we want, but we can always go further and really hone in what it is we want to achieve and for whom and what it's going to look like and what success is going to look like and why failure simply won't do.
Thank you.
I just want to take Rob's question around mindset and living in the last 40 years. I mean, as Barbara mentioned at the start, 70% of the folks in this building alone are millennials, and most of them weren't born 40 years ago. So they're not too concerned about some of that history. I think we run these intrapreneur challenges where we get hundreds of our colleagues from Barclays in a room and start to think through different business models and approaches to driving innovation, and their ability now to convene and connect across their peer group, both internally and externally, is quite something to behold. We had 2 young entrepreneurs who joined our Entrepreneur Challenge just a few years ago, and they launched, off the back of their experience, they launched their own network, their circle of young entrepreneurs, they call it. In the space of a year, they've now built a network of 3,500 other entrepreneurs across huge companies in 15 different cities around the world. So I'm pretty optimistic about the ability for our youngsters in business, to our next generation of leaders, to forget about some of that mindset challenge that you said and bring that optimistic approach to driving change.
Thank you.
To speak, I have a government point, and I just think about what you said about government being the gorilla in the room. And perhaps a slightly sort of different take. I mean, I think one of the challenges we've got with the SDGs is that they're immense. They're huge global challenges, and we've got a very short period of time to deliver on them. So that urgency and that need for pragmatism is massive. And then I think about SDG 4, which I understand was a learning company we think about the most because it's all about education. And everyone obviously agrees about delivery of quality of education for all. And in an ideal world, everyone would want that to be public provision, government provision of that. But we all know that governments across the world are struggling with the demands to be able to provide quality education, and that there is a role for private sector, for low-cost private schools, etc., to play. But there's a philosophical versus a pragmatic piece here about how fast do we want to move and how quickly do we want to be able to scale, and then think about the trade-offs of what that means. And I don't actually think it is a trade-off. I think there's a role for low-cost private schools to play, not a major role, but it will also help raise all boats. And as we've seen with organisations, probably the most controversial like Bridge, they have real impact in raising, the quality of education across the board. So I think that government piece also comes back to the very wording of the SDGs and a conversation about, with 14 years left to go, or less than that, how do we make that trade-off between pragmatism and urgency and need to scale, and what are the compromises that's going to take?
Absolutely. No, great. I think great way to finish. And I think just 3 closing comments from my side. I think our panel have captured the whole range of both opportunities and challenges. And I think sort of one way to look at them is there's absolutely the sort of internal question. What are companies doing internally? What are they doing? Not just to get the CEO involved, but all the senior management, the R&D people, the product development, business development people. How are we putting metrics and incentives in place that middle managers get engaged, as well as unleashing the unleashing the passion of employees as entrepreneurs within the company. So there's that internal piece. Clearly on the external side, what do we call them, sort of cross-sector, or just working together towards a common vision, the sort of the B2B, the big B to big B, business-to-business partnerships, I think we need more of within sectors, across sectors. The business to small entrepreneur, Daniel, you're demonstrating, acumen and others have demonstrated it is possible, and we just need now more of that. The business to NGOs, civil society, the GSK Save the Children, there's so many great examples in this room and yourselves in Save the Children that demonstrate that's possible. And then absolutely the business to government, and I think the Global Innovation Fund is a great example. It goes both ways, as well as business influencing government in a more progressive way around sort of standards and policies. So there's that sort of external partnership agenda. And then thirdly, this whole question of the ecosystem. And that ecosystem is partly these large coalitions, sort of sector-based coalitions. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely influencing policy, because if we don't get the policies right and the market incentives, we're just not going to get the scale. And it's influencing the consumers, which Sue, you spoke about, and the investors. and stock exchanges. And I think all three of those areas are sort of the internal, with sort of rigorous respect for human rights, managing environmental impacts, and then looking at those innovation opportunities and new products, technologies, and services. The external one-on-one type partnerships, and then the sort of ecosystem building are all needed, and it's complex, and yet I think the Sustainable Development Goals do give us probably the best framework we've had to mobilize around that. And I think just in closing, there's sort of three tensions but also opportunities we've got to work at, which our panelists have brought out. This being massively ambitious on the one hand and yet putting aside ego, and sort of being ambitious for a common agenda, not just the individual agendas, but using the individual assets and capabilities to get there. Sort of secondly, being excited and energetic and passionate, but also evidence-based and rigorous and accountable in what we're doing. And then thirdly, as several of our panelists said, be really impatient. It is urgent. We've really got to be short-term focused, get as many results, and be pragmatic as possible, but also be recognizing that long-term commitment is often essential to move the agenda forward. So thank you very much for the panelists for being a great panel. Thanks for your questions, and now we'll have a break.